Chris, appreciate you taking the time, my friend. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for doing this. How was your weekend?
It was good, man. It was busy, as it always is. Hard to believe we're already through week 8 now and almost through the month of October. Seems like we're getting down the stretch. And I think the lesson learned not only in this conference but nationally is that as the season wears on, as the physical and mental toll that the schedule takes on you, weird things start to happen. There were a lot of close potential upsets that didn't occur. Virginia takes down North Carolina. I really think over the next 5 weeks, we're going to see some significant upsets take place, and the pressure ratchets up. We'll get the first college football playoff rankings coming out here in a little over a week, and I think that pressure will certainly force some of these teams that may be kind of pretending right now to be exposed.
Yeah, Chris, it was a great weekend for the underdogs, not just in college, but the NFL as well. So interesting for sure. Chris, we'll start with all that happened in week 8. Of course, we'll start in Como. When you watch South Carolina, obviously 34-12 loss. Gamecocks have lost 3 in a row, fall to 2-5. Now you got a trip to Texas A&M looming. How concerning is it to you what you're seeing from South Carolina at this point in year 3 of Shane Beamer's tenure?
Well, I think, heading into the season, we knew this was going to be a team that had a lot of youth and experience at a lot of positions. Even more youth has been pushed into having to play more with the injuries. I don't know if I've seen a more snake bit team as it relates to injuries. They continue to pile up at some of the worst positions. Having Rashawn Lee out this last week was certainly detrimental as well. But the thing that I like about it, and I don't know why anybody would expect anything different, they play hard for Shane Beamer. The team always shows up and plays with a lot of effort and intensity. That spurt before halftime that Missouri went on, they're up, score four times on 4 straight possessions. They go up 24-3. Thought that maybe it was going to turn into a blowout, but the defense played better in the second half. You saw Spencer Rattler do what he's done all year long and try to bring his team back. Unfortunately for the Gamecocks, they couldn't get into the end zone. But I'll say this, that's a really good Missouri team having to go to a place that's kind of a sneaky, challenging place to go play. And I thought that they kind of held their own despite having, so many holes to fill due to injuries. And I know that we don't believe in moral victories in this conference, but, I think I would worry if it was a situation like I saw in Arkansas. I'm not quite as worried because of the fight that I saw from South Carolina on Saturday.
And Chris, speaking of Arkansas, of course, the Hogs fall to Mississippi State 7-3, a game that set back offensive football years. It felt like watching that thing unfold. Sam Pittman makes the decision to fire Dan Enos basically in the middle of year 1 of his tenure. I think it was a move. It kind of feels like, Chris, out of desperation, one that had to be made, obviously, because as his seat warms up. And I felt like that was the game Saturday that may have put the final nail in the coffin for Pittman. Maybe this is a move that buys him some more time, and especially if they finish the season strong. Your thoughts on the game, but most importantly, Pittman's decision to fire Dan Enos and what you think that means for his tenure moving forward.
Let's go back to not the decision to fire him, but the decision to hire him in the offseason. After Kendall Briles leaves, it seemed like an odd kind of choice. I know that Dan Enos had a history at Arkansas, had been with Sam Pittman before, but this offensive depth chart was built to play in a much different style. I feel bad for KJ Jefferson, honestly. I mean, the offensive line is not very good. They haven't been able to run the football all year long, and they can't protect him. The receivers don't get open, so he's out there on his own trying to make things happen. And the offense has no identity whatsoever. They don't do anything creative to try to, move him around and not let him just being a sitting duck there in the pocket. They don't run him, which I think is one of his better strengths that you could certainly utilize. And the limitations on what they're doing in terms of the route concepts just seems very rudimentary. So I'm not surprised that they made the move with Dan Enos. I hope that this was an effort to provide a little insulation for himself and that it does buy him another year, because I think he's done a great job of taking over a disaster from Chad Morris. But honestly, the way that it felt on Saturday after that game felt very reminiscent of what we felt after a couple of those losses to Western Kentucky, to San Jose State, to North Texas that occurred at home when Chad Morris was here in his final couple of years. Apathy is one of the worst emotions you can have. And right now, there's still a little anger and disappointment. But when you get to the point of being apathetic, that's when it becomes time to make a move.
Chris, certainly apathy and emotion that Gamecock Nation feels and can relate to what you're saying. They've certainly been in that position before. Let's move to Tuscaloosa, Chris. I thought Alabama showed great fight, heart, resiliency, toughness, what have you, whatever adjective you want to use in that comeback win. Looked like Tennessee was going to make it two in a roll to a victory, and Bama with a big second half comeback. I know Volunteer fans this morning, as many of them out there complaining about referees, but you go back and look at this game, it feels like Alabama, they just really took it to Tennessee in that second half.
They did, and they set the tone coming right out of the halftime locker room. You know, they get the ball on offense, get the big run on first down, hit the long pass over the top to Isaiah Bond. So 2 plays, 41 seconds into the second half, you cut that 13-point lead down to 6. The defense goes out there, forces a 3-and-out and a punt, and away things were going. The momentum was clearly on the side of Alabama. You saw a couple moves of desperation by Josh Heupel going for it on fourth down on their own end. The defense not only forces a turnover, but they get 2 turnovers on downs. They get the scoop and score for the touchdown. They win 27-0 in the second half. I thought it was a great example of not panicking because Tennessee had Alabama on their heels. I mean, they were going up and down the field, 187 yards of offense in that first 15 minutes alone. But the defense did a great job of keeping them out of the end zone. And I thought that was much like what we saw earlier in the season where they had to maybe hold on while the offense figured things out. They were able to stabilize and force field goals on a couple possessions inside the red zone. That is a recipe for losing against Alabama. You got to be able to score touchdowns when you have the opportunity, and Tennessee was not able to do that. But I thought that they played a pretty near perfect first half outside of that. Joe Milton starts 9 of 9. The receivers are catching the ball much better than they had before, getting some decent protection. So credit to Alabama for not going into the locker room and panicking. They came out, made a few adjustments, and were able to win that one going away.
Now, Chris, to the Plains, we talked about this one last week, that it's always tough to go into Jordan-Hare and play well and win. Ole Miss able to do that, final score of 28-21. What did you see from this ball game? Quinshon Judkins has a big night, 124 yards rushing, 202 yards passing for Jackson Dart. He was pretty efficient outside of the one interception. And, for Auburn, obviously, it's just continuing to try to find as much as you can out of the quarterback position. But what did you see specifically? And there's no such thing as a bad win on the road in the SEC, especially when it comes under the lights at Jordan-Hare.
Yeah, going to Jordan-Hare is one of the toughest places you have to play in the conference. Ask Georgia that. They struggled there a couple of weeks ago. This was going to be a huge test for them, not only because of that environment, but because of the health of Jackson Dart, the health of Trey Harris. Those guys looked like they were back to full strength. It was 14-14 at halftime, and the Rebels did what they've done all year long, and that's come out and play a great second half. They've a team that's trying to ascend to kind of the next level in the SEC. And I think this was a huge confidence builder for them, not only to show that they could go on the road and win, but show that maybe when you're not playing your best, you can find a way to get a victory, which they were able to do. Jackson Dart still continues to be a great dual threat quarterback. When he's healthy, he certainly puts the pressure on you with his running ability. But I do think that this is a team that's not being talked about enough. And I love the fact that we're heading into the final week of October, and we got 3 teams in the West that are still alive and 3 teams in the East that are still alive. This could be chaotic as we go through the last month of the season.
Chris, as we look at Week 9 upcoming this weekend, of course, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, which, yes, that's what I still call it, Chris, and I will forever and ever call it that. That is a game, Chris, admittedly, that is actually on my bucket list. Like, I'm eventually going to find myself in Jacksonville, Florida for Florida and Georgia. And you played in this ball game. Did you play in it when it was in Jacksonville? Because I know it was back and forth.
Yeah, so just to give the full history, man, I grew up a lifelong Gator fan. Both my parents graduated from the University of Florida. My father was a professor at the College of Pharmacy there. So we went to all the home games, but I always wanted to go to Jacksonville to watch the Florida-Georgia game. my parents would never take me because every year it was disappointment, whether it was Buck Bellew to Lindsey Scott in the final seconds or Herschel Walker running up and down the field 44-0. Georgia found many ways to torture us Gator fans. So my first experience going was actually selling programs to get into the stadium, and had a chance to be there for a big Florida win there in the later 80s. But I was always intrigued with what this game meant, how special it was. There's a Hall of Fame devoted just to this ball game, and I think that speaks to the tradition. I think it speaks to the importance of the game. I, for one, believe that this game should always be played in Jacksonville. I did experience it as a home and home. You may remember when they were tearing down the Gator Bowl to build the Jaguar Stadium. We played it in Gainesville in '94 and played it in Athens in '95. So I experienced playing in all three venues, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, while it was a novel thing to get a chance to be a part of, playing home and home with Georgia, it's so much better there. The 50-50 orange and blue, red and black, the number of tailgaters that come out just to be a part of the atmosphere, driving over the bridge as we're coming from the TPC Sawgrass Hotel we stay in, and seeing just the visuals was always one of my favorite things to do. And it's in a world that tradition is going away, particularly here in our conference, it's one that we need to hold on to. So I'm excited about the fact that we get a chance to go back over to Jacksonville this week.
Yeah, Chris, I don't think too many Gator fans, though, will complain about the home and home you guys had back in 94, 95, especially 95. And I think it was Steve Spurrier. He knew going in that 50 had never been dropped at Sanford. And, of course, you guys go and do the deed in Athens, which I know Gator fans still probably look back to this day with a smile on their face. But, yeah, the question I was going to get to, Chris, is just I like, for somebody who's never been, can you describe the electricity of that environment? And I've heard from many people about, the weekend start, people go down to St. Simon's and party and then go up to Jacksonville or what have you. And I mean, it's one of those, again, for me as a college football fan, it's certainly on my bucket list because I've heard so many great things of just the passion, the energy, and electricity. And oh, by the way, it is a heated rivalry. There's no love lost between these two teams.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, the streaks that the rivalry has gone in. The 80s largely dominated by the Bulldogs. The 90s, we dominated it. So it's right now seems to be on the path of the Georgia dominance here with the teams that they've had, the wins that they've had against us over there. But I do think that the electricity you talked about, it's a unique environment because there's never a quiet moment where, you play a home game when something good happens for the opposing team, it's very quiet. There, half the stadium's always cheering, whether it's a good play by Florida or a good play for Georgia. Somebody's happy about what's taking place. So you talk about Kirby Smart has lobbied for this game to go back to being a home and home or going to a home and home. But the Georgia fans, they all make it a point of travel to get down there to the north or to the South Georgia islands, as you talked about. The students don't have school on Friday, so they can all get down there. It just is one of the great traditions, and it's one that even if you don't have tickets, just getting to Jacksonville and feeling that electricity starting on about over at the RV park, they start showing up probably tomorrow morning, and again, that's one of the great traditions as well.
So sticking with that, Chris, when you look at this year's chapter of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, the Florida Gators, this game's a little bit more intriguing than I think we thought it was going to be a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, Florida, Chris, coming in off the bye, both teams are, but Florida coming off that big win over South Carolina, starting to build some momentum, some confidence, especially on the offensive side of the football. Georgia without Brock Bowers. How do you see this one shaking out? How much of a chance do you give Florida to pull the upset over the number one ranked Dogs?
Yeah, I give them a better chance now without Brock Bowers than I probably would have a week ago. The other thing that has me feeling a little optimistic about Florida's chances is the emergence of the deep vertical passing game. That was not something that was a part of the offense much last year or even in the first month and a half of the season this year. But they found the ability to push the ball down the field. Ricky Pearsall is a tremendous weapon, but I think you see Trey Harris, the freshman, come in and do some great things. Khalil Jackson, the former walk-on from Gainesville, who has become a starter for the Gators, has done a nice job. There's a lot of weapons that I think the quarterback has at his disposal that Anthony Richardson didn't have at his last year. So I think they're figuring themselves out. The key to me will the offensive line be able to block up front, to protect long enough to get some shots down the field. Can they be able to move guys off the line of scrimmage? They haven't been as dominant up front running the football as they were last year. But I do think that Florida has a chance in this ballgame. The question to me is, like, all of the optimism that is out there around the program, how much of that is real and how much of that is based on beating a 2-win South Carolina team that you probably could have and should have lost to? So I need to see Florida back it up. Once we saw them beat Tennessee, Florida fans were feeling pretty optimistic, and then they went out and got blown out in Lexington. How much of the goodwill goes away from the South Carolina win if you go out there and you're not competitive with Georgia on Saturday? I think that's something I need to see a little more consistency from Florida before I truly believe it.
Now, Chris, to College Station we go. South Carolina taking on the Texas A&M Aggies in a venue in which the Gamecocks, Chris, have never won before. Of course, you might recall last year South Carolina snapping that 7-game losing streak. They had never beaten the Aggies before last year. Gamecocks opened as a 2-touchdown underdog. This is a team, again, lost 3 in a row, looking for something to feel good about. Texas A&M, of course, they've had their own struggles, but coming off the bye week. And, you know, you look at this game, Chris, the number one thing that jumps out are 2 things, my greatest concerns. Number one, South Carolina has a plethora of injuries, and they're flat out just not very good on the offensive line specifically. And while Texas A&M is wildly inconsistent, and Chris, I don't trust Texas A&M for anything, they're elite in the trenches, especially that defensive front. And also, Chris, you look at the road splits, home and road for Spencer Rattler. And granted, give credit to the competition he's faced, but he's just been a completely different quarterback away from Williams-Brice Stadium. So when you look at this game, I don't know where to find the hope and optimism for South Carolina, admittedly, because, again, as porous as Texas A&M has been, and weird things happen in 11 a.m. local kickoff times, right, Chris? We know that, but it feels like this is a game that I think looks much, much, much more difficult for South Carolina now than it did over the summer because of some of their deficiencies and the injuries they're facing going into this one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't give you or the Gamecock fan base a whole lot of hope or inspiration right now because styles make fights. And right now what I see is an injured, tired-looking South Carolina team versus a Texas A&M team coming off of a bye. I know they played a physical game last time out against Tennessee, but, you know, hopefully for their perspective, you can put that behind you and try to get a little healthy and rested during the bye week. I also think the matchups that you talked about on the lines of scrimmage is not favorable at all for South Carolina. I just don't see how they're going to be able to protect against what I think is one of the best front sevens in the conference. Spencer Rattler's in for another long night of getting hit. I don't really believe that they can line up and run the football. On the other side, the Texas A&M offensive line was taken advantage of by Tennessee, but I don't see South Carolina having the same sort of construction of talent on that front seven that Tennessee does. So I don't know that they're going to be able to pressure Max Johnson the same way. If they can, maybe that's their best opportunity to hit him and force him into some bad throws. But right now, it just seems like a very poor matchup for where South Carolina is in their season.
Chris, to Lexington, Kentucky, and this is a game I think really interesting between the Wildcats and Tennessee. You know, I feel like Kentucky's been one of the most disappointing teams in regards to preseason expectation, preseason hype, what we thought they were going to be, or at least how they were going to look and what they are at this current juncture. I feel like this is a game for Kentucky that if you're going to put it all together, if you're going to look how most folks expected, this is the ball game, right? Because you got a Tennessee team coming off that loss to Bama, a high-quality football team, no doubt, but I think a beatable football team, night game at Kroger Field. What are you expecting from this one, and what are you most looking forward to from this matchup between the Wildcats and Vols?
Yeah, I hope Kentucky was able to find a way to get back on track during the bye week. A lot of hope for the Wildcats. I've been a promoter of that program for a long time. They go out there, they're not competitive against Georgia, and then look completely lost the final 3 quarters of the game against Missouri at home, nonetheless. So they've got to find a way to bounce back. Tennessee is a very physical team on both lines of scrimmage. When they get it going, they're as good as anybody in this league. They showed that in the first 30 minutes of the game in Tuscaloosa on Saturday. The question is, like you said, what is the mindset? Where are they in terms of being able to put the Alabama game behind them? And can they continue to have some success throwing the football like they did in that first quarter? I mentioned Joe Milton's start, 9 of 9. He seemed like he was confident throwing the football. The receivers were catching it. When they have a little bit of the complement of the downfield passing game, it makes that run offense even more difficult to defend. And so I do think that I would probably lean Tennessee at this point. But you go and look at the schedule so far. They didn't play very well against Florida in Gainesville in the first half of that ball game before getting back on track. They played well in the first half, but didn't play well in the second half. I haven't seen Tennessee put a 4-quarter game together yet. So if you're Kentucky, maybe you're feeling pretty good about that. And if you can get your offensive identity back to be able to throw the football, which we thought they were going to do with that great group of receivers and a quarterback coming over from NC State through the portal that had a lot of success there previously in Raleigh. You figure that piece out, maybe they can pull off the upset at home.
Now, Chris, the best of the rest in the SEC slate: Auburn, Mississippi State at 3:30, the SEC Network game, and then Ole Miss and Vandy, the other SEC Network game, primetime, 7:30 kick. Anything from those two games stand out to you? It feels like kind of two pillow fights, admittedly, although Ole Miss is, astonishingly enough, had some trouble with Vandy over the years. But anything jump out to you from those two games specifically?
I wouldn't say anything specifically. I look at Ole Miss's schedule, man. I think it sets up really nicely for them. They get the game against Vandy coming up. I believe they have another home game after that, and then they have to go to Athens. But this is a team, I think at worst, we end up seeing sitting at 10-2 at the end of the year. And I think that's a pretty good year for Lane Kiffin, given all of the turnover on the roster from last year to this year. So things headed in the right direction. And who knows if LSU can go out there and find a way to beat Alabama in 2 weeks and you figure out a way to upset Georgia at home, you may be talking about your first SEC championship appearance in the last year's divisions. They could actually win the West.
Chris, last thing before I get you out of here, and again, I appreciate you being gracious with your time. This is something I've been posing, a question I've been posing to a couple of different people, but it's just something that's interesting to me because what this season has taught me, Chris, following South Carolina, following other schools, but obviously being connected to the Gamecocks, and, over the offseason, Shane Beamer was a guy who I would have labeled as untouchable, like really, truly, because of the goodwill he had built up, the finish to the 2022 season, recruiting momentum, etc. Right? I would have labeled him as such, and now you hit the halfway point of the third year of his tenure, and you've actually got South Carolina fans that have become so restless. They're questioning the future of his tenure in Columbia. We're seeing it also at Arkansas with Sam Pittman, Chris. I think those two programs are actually really similar. Sam Pittman and Shane Beamer, similar to their respective schools, where they're like, we got our guy. He embodies our culture. He embodies our program. I say all that to ask you this, Chris, because patience is something that SEC football fans, college football fans as a whole, but especially SEC football fans don't have. And, Chris, coaches used to get 5, 6, 7 years to get recruiting classes in and build programs, but things like NIL, transfer portal, they've expedited the expectations, or they've made that window much shorter for coaches to turn things around.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's easy to put like a specific number of years on it or length of time because, right, it's a different challenge at Florida than it is at South Carolina. Let's just call it for what it is. But how long do you feel like coaches should be awarded? Because it's such a win now culture where it's like, not what have you done for me lately, literally what have you done for me in the last game, right? And if you're not winning, I think what we're seeing, you can have the best culture, you can be the funniest coach, like all that stuff doesn't matter. Wins and losses, that's literally all that matters. I mean, your thoughts on the increased pressures that I think head coaches are getting so early in their tenure?
Yeah, it is an interesting change in the way that the transfer portal and the way that NIL has maybe created an unrealistic expectation of what roster construction can do in just a matter of a year. I'm a big fan of Sam Pittman's. I'm a big fan of Shane Beamer's. I think Shane Beamer in each of his first couple seasons in Columbia exceeded what my expectations were for them, what most of the fans' expectations probably were. And we knew coming into the season with all the youth that they were going to be forced into playing, that there were going to be some growing pains. It was a tough schedule that they've had to play. They've been in some close ball games. Maybe the most troubling thing to me, just the lines of scrimmage not being better on offense and the defensive lines, and how important that is to this conference. But I don't see a team that's giving up. I see a team that plays really hard for Shane Beamer, and I think that's a good sign. And I do think, you would know this better than I do, but from the standpoint of what they're doing on the recruiting trail, it still seems like they have a lot of momentum and a lot of people excited about the program. So nobody finished the season last year hotter than what South Carolina and Shane Beamer did with those wins over Tennessee and Clemson in a matter of 7-8 days there. So I don't think things should change yet. I think you got to stay the course, particularly with what you've seen in Tallahassee. Mike Norvell was a guy that Florida State fans wanted out of there the first couple seasons. They had to hang in there largely because they didn't have any options for the buyout. But that has paid dividends now and has them undefeated and sights on getting into a college football playoff game. So I think you just have to try to resist the temptation to have the unrealistic expectations for our schools and understand that this is the league. Every league game that one coach wins, there's another one that's losing. It's a zero-sum kind of situation. And that was one of the reasons why when we talked to the coaches down at spring meetings in Destin back in May, they're not for expanding to the 9-game conference schedule. It's only going to put more losses in the coaches' win-loss columns, and it's going to create a lot of pressure and even more turnover, most likely.
Chris Doering of SEC Network. Chris, thoroughly enjoy these conversations every Monday. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for your insight. Always look forward to it and can't wait to do it again next week, my friend. And good luck to the Gators, by the way, in the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. I personally cannot wait to watch that game. I will make the trip at some point. I can guarantee you. When I do, I will let you know.
Let me know, man. Good to be on with you. Talk to you guys next week.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you, Chris. Great stuff.